On a grey autumn morning in November 2000, a man in a military uniform walked up to a microphone in Baghdad and made an announcement that almost nobody outside the oil industry noticed. Saddam Hussein declared that from that day forward, Iraq would no longer sell its oil for American dollars. Every barrel leaving the country would be priced in euros instead. It was a small technical change on paper. 3 years later, his country was in ruins. His statues were being pulled down, and he himself was hiding in a hole in the ground. The official reason for the invasion of Iraq was weapons of mass destruction. Those weapons were never found. The second official reason was democracy. That democracy never really arrived. So what was it really about? To answer that question, you have to go back much further than 2003. You have to go back more than a century to a pattern that has repeated itself in almost every major American military action since the 1890s. A pattern that the history books mention only in footnotes. But once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Every war has two stories. There is the story told to the public, the noble one, the one about freedom and security and defending the innocent. And then there is the other story, the one written in ledgers and shipping manifests and quarterly earnings reports, the story that begins not in a war room, but in a boardroom. To understand that pattern, you have to start in the year 1898. The United States was a young power, hungry for markets, and 90 miles off the coast of Florida sat the island of Cuba. Cuba at that time produced roughly 1/3 of the world's sugar. American companies had already sunk something like $50 million into Cuban plantations and refineries, an enormous sum for the era. But Cuba still belonged to Spain, and the Spanish taxed American sugar interests heavily. The investors wanted Spain out. Then, in February of 1898, an American battleship called the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor. 261 sailors died. The American press, led by the newspaper barons William Randolph Hearst and Joseph Pulitzer, immediately blamed Spain. Remember the Maine? They screamed on every front page. Within weeks, the United States was at war. Within months, Spain had lost not only Cuba, but also Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The sugar barons got their island. And here is the twist that most people never learn. A later investigation by the American Navy itself, conducted in 1976, concluded that the explosion on the Maine was almost certainly an internal accident. A coal bunker fire. No Spanish attack at all. 5 years later, in 1903, President Theodore Roosevelt wanted something else. He wanted a canal. A canal across the narrow strip of land called Panama would cut the sailing distance between New York and San Francisco almost in half. A revolution for shipping and for the United States Navy. The problem was that Panama at that time belonged to Colombia, and the Colombian Senate had refused to sell the rights. So Roosevelt did something remarkable. He helped organize a revolution. American warships appeared off the coast of Panama. A convenient independence movement declared itself. Colombia was blocked from sending troops. Within 3 days, Panama was a new country. Within 2 weeks, the new country had signed away the canal zone to the United States. Roosevelt later bragged, in his own words, that he took the canal. Fast forward half a century to 1953. In Iran, a democratically elected prime minister named Mossadegh had just done something unthinkable. He had nationalized the country's oil. For decades, a British company, today known as British Petroleum, had controlled Iranian oil fields and kept the overwhelming majority of the profits. Iran received only a tiny share. Mossadegh said, "Enough, the oil belongs to Iran." London panicked and went to Washington for help. The Central Intelligence Agency, working with British intelligence, ran an operation called Ajax. They paid off newspapers, bribed politicians, hired street mobs, and within weeks the elected government of Iran collapsed. The Shah returned to power. Western oil companies, including American ones this time, got their share of Iranian oil. Iran would not have another free election for decades. 1 year later, in 1954, almost the same thing happened on the other side of the world. In Guatemala, another elected president, Jacobo Arbenz, had announced a land reform program. He wanted to buy back unused agricultural land from a huge American corporation called the United Fruit Company and redistribute it to landless peasants. He offered to pay the company the exact value that the company itself had declared on its tax forms. The company was outraged because, of course, on its tax forms, it had lied about the land's value for years. United Fruit had powerful friends in Washington. The head of the Central Intelligence Agency at the time, Allen Dulles, had sat on its board. His brother, the Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, had represented the company as a lawyer. Within months, a small army of exiles, trained, armed, and flown in by the agency, overthrew Arbenz. The land reform was cancelled. United Fruit kept its plantations, and Guatemala entered a 36-year civil war that would kill roughly 200,000 people. By the time the United States entered Vietnam in the 1960s, the public story had become about stopping communism, and there was truth in that. The Cold War was real. But beneath the ideology, there was something else. Vietnam and the surrounding region held enormous reserves of tin, tungsten, and rubber. A single confidential memo from the State Department in 1965, later declassified, explicitly mentioned the importance of these raw materials to American industry. The war would last another 10 years. 58,000 Americans would die. Between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese would die. And the men who supplied the helicopters, the napalm, and the rifles would become some of the richest defense contractors in American history. Now, here is where the story takes a darker turn. Because after Vietnam, the pattern changed. It became less about specific commodities like sugar or bananas or rubber. It became about the something much bigger. It became about the dollar itself. In 1971, President Richard Nixon made a decision that almost no one at the time understood. He ended the link between the American dollar and gold. For decades, any country holding dollars could in theory exchange them for physical gold from the United States Treasury. Nixon cut that cord. Overnight, the dollar became a piece of paper backed by nothing but trust. The obvious question was, who would keep trusting it? The answer came 2 years later. In a secret deal with Saudi Arabia, the Saudis agreed to sell their oil exclusively in dollars and to invest their profits back into American government bonds. In exchange, the United States guaranteed the security of the Saudi royal family. That deal was soon extended to the rest of the oil-producing world. It became known as the Petrodollar system. And from that moment on, every country on Earth that wanted to buy oil first had to buy dollars. It was the greatest financial arrangement in history, and almost no one outside of central banks understood how much power it gave Washington. Which brings us back to Saddam Hussein and that quiet announcement in November 2000. By switching Iraqi oil sales from dollars to euros, Saddam was not just making a trade decision, he was striking at the very foundation of American financial dominance. If other oil producers had followed him, Iran, Venezuela, Russia, the petrodollar system could have collapsed within a decade. Trillions of dollars held by foreign central banks would have flooded back to the United States, causing massive inflation and forcing catastrophic cuts in American government spending. It was, in the cold language of geopolitics, an existential threat. 3 years later, American tanks rolled into Baghdad. Within weeks of the invasion, the new authorities in Iraq quietly switched oil sales back to dollars. That detail appeared in almost no newspaper. 8 years after Iraq, it happened again. In 2010, the leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi, announced an audacious plan. He wanted to create a pan-African currency backed by gold, a gold dinar. He proposed that African and Middle Eastern oil producers sell their oil only for this new currency, bypassing both the dollar and the euro entirely. Libya at the time held roughly 143 tons of gold, one of the largest reserves in Africa. Leaked emails from the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, released years later, explicitly mentioned Gaddafi's gold plan as a motivation for supporting the rebellion against him. In 2011, a coalition of Western air forces bombed Libya for 7 months. Gaddafi was eventually caught by rebels, beaten and killed in the street. His gold reserves disappeared. The Dinar project died with him. Libya today remains a broken country, fought over by militias. So let us step back and look at the whole century. The sugar of Cuba, the Canal of Panama, the oil of Iran, the bananas of Guatemala, the rubber of Vietnam, the petrodollar in Iraq, the gold of Libya. 7 wars, 7 different public justifications, and underneath each one, the same quiet engine. Money, control of a resource, control of a trade route, control of a currency. The pattern does not require a secret meeting of shadowy men in a dark room. It does not require a global conspiracy. It only requires that the people who make foreign policy and the people who own the assets are very often the same people, or have lunch together. What does this mean for right now, today? Look at the current tensions in the world and ask the old question: who benefits financially? Look at the sanctions on Russia and notice how they pushed Moscow into selling oil to China in yuan instead of dollars. Look at the recent agreements between Saudi Arabia and China to begin pricing some oil in Chinese currency. Look at the expanding group of countries: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, Iran, and others, openly discussing alternatives to the dollar system. For the first time in 50 years, the Petrodollar foundation is cracking. And if history is any guide, Washington does not respond gently when that foundation is threatened. So, here is the uncomfortable question, the one the official story never asks. If every major American military action of the past 125 years has had an economic engine hidden beneath the moral justification, what happens when the biggest economic engine of them all, the dollar itself, is in danger? What happens when the threat is not a single dictator in a single country, but an entire block of nations building an alternative system? We have seen what happened to the men who tried it alone. Mossadegh was overthrown, Saddam was hanged, Gaddafi was shot in the street. They were, in each case, small examples, warnings to anyone watching. There are roughly 3 ways this could unfold in the next decade. In the first scenario, the dollar holds, the alternatives fragment, the sanctions work, and the old system survives another generation. In the second scenario, the transition happens slowly and peacefully. A gradual shift to a multi-currency world where no single country holds the financial lever. In the third scenario, the transition is resisted the way it has always been resisted, with force. And because the players this time are not small countries with a single commodity, but nuclear powers with global reach, the consequences could be something the world has not seen since the middle of the last century. The men and women who lived through the Cold War learned one lesson above all others. When great powers feel their foundations slipping, they do not go quietly. They do not issue press releases and retire. They fight. And the story they tell the public while they fight will sound, as it always has, like a story about freedom and security and defending the innocent. The real story, the one written in ledgers and shipping manifests and quarterly earnings, will only become clear decades later, in documents nobody bothers to declassify until the men who signed them are already dead. So the next time you hear the drums begin to beat, the next time a president stands at a podium and explains why your country must act, why the threat is urgent, why there is no other choice, remember the sugar of Cuba, remember the canal of Panama, remember the oil, the bananas, the rubber, the petrodollar, the gold, and ask yourself the only question that has ever mattered in the history of war. Who, this time, is going to get paid?